Hello, everyone.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining in again. The only change that has happened today is I'm trying to sit outdoors. I don't know how many of you are sitting and attending lectures outdoors. It feels so different. So just as we do every time, we'll take the first minute or two to just chit chat. Julie, I just want to confirm, was Allison able to join?
Hi, sorry, I'm looking in the wrong place. Hi, she should be. She's got the link and she should be connecting any minute.
Yeah, so we'll just wait for her to connect. And then once she connects, she can also just do a quick intro. So as we discussed last week, we are still in the theme of measuring the planet, but we are moving from the ocean after that inspirational 2 lectures to also not ignore the other ecosystem, the terrestrial ecosystem. So today and the next lecture will be focused on terrestrial ecosystems. I think today we will emphasize and highlight the work of a few individuals that are directly engaged in conservation efforts and technology, intersection of technology and conservation. And then the next lecture in this same case study on terrestrial ecosystems would be the context of infectious diseases, and we would bring several of the folks and champions that have been focused on COVID surveillance, but then again, also highlight the importance of other disease surveillances that we should have been doing anyway, including helminth infections and many of the soil transmitted diseases that are involved. But so just as a breakdown of this case study, it's much more focused on the problem domain, and we will fuse, unlike what we've been doing, we've been separating technology from the problem. Now you would hear both on the problems and the technologies involved. So if Allison is on the call, I just want Allison to just briefly introduce herself. Otherwise, we can just get started. Oh, some logistics before. Julie, whenever Allison is on the call, you can interrupt and let Tyler know to give her command. And then also okay. Tyler, today's speakers would also be Shah is also on the line. So can you just make sure he has all the privileges to share and other sets of threads. So I think just before we begin the main course, I just want to briefly say a word or two about the logistics of Tuesday. Tuesday would be the first time the teams would be presenting a short pitch of the idea that they're working on. And especially in the context of this would allow, I will request all the mentors to join as well on Tuesday. For some of you, I've already listed the sets of mentors that would be engaged on the projects, but this is really the rubber meets the road part of the class. Because of course, we all came together to actually solve problems. And I see now Allison is on the line. But one of the threads that we would do on Tuesday, logistically, we would have to do this in a very structured manner. So think of it as 3 slides. You introduce the problem, you introduce the class of solutions that you're thinking about, and you end with the team that you have structured and what skill sets they already have. And you make a request for other skill sets that you might be looking for in recruiting on your team. That's the primary theme that we would do. We would go through this in a rapid manner, but I think it would be very valuable to just get a sense for the breadth of ideas that have already been created. And especially for mentors, it would be very valuable to hear, because then they will get a chance to say, oh, these are the sets of teams that I'm excited about. Tyler, one thing we should do is definitely provide a unique ID number for every team, because sometimes teams are working on multiple projects as well. Different teams are working on the same project or same idea, not the other way around. I think no one person should be working on 2 projects. So kind of with that as a background, maybe when I have time in the very end, if there is a little bit of time, I will briefly describe some things about how to set up your workspace and especially drive to the toy store, but I'll do that in the very end of this lecture, but let's dive in. So I think we will start with, maybe Allison, could you just do a quick intro And then we will start with you, Shah, first, and then we will transition to Julie and Allison. But Allison, could you do a brief intro for everybody?
Sure. I'm sorry, I had a hard time logging in. Am I introducing our lab or myself?
You can first introduce yourself, but then you can also introduce the broader lab. But then you will get a chance to, I think the way we'll structure is maybe for the first 45 minutes, Shah will talk a little bit about on the terrestrial ecosystems and solutions he's been working on. And then the next 45 or so minutes, 30 to 45 minutes, we'll structure on a project in Liz's lab, but also just the direct things that both you and Julie do.
Okay, great. Well, I'm Allison Stegner. I'm a postdoc in the Hadley lab. I'm a paleoecologist or conservation paleontologist, so I think about how we can use deep time records to inform conservation today. The Hadley lab is really focused on how does biodiversity react to and interact with human impacts. And we do that from many different perspectives. We do it using fossils, we use DNA, we use kind of on the ground field studies, and we're really looking at all kinds of organisms, bacteria. We've got students working on E. coli, vertebrate diversity. I study vegetation change right now. So it's really how do humans impact our planet today. Yeah, so we've got a lot more details for later. I'll let Julie dive in at that point.
Yeah. Okay, so because we have a full agenda, Shah, I'll pass that baton to you. And maybe you can just one-liner also reintroduce yourself, just so everybody remembers. Tyler, can you unmute and make Shah the host? Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Hey everyone. So my name's Shah Selby. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background in the beginning of this presentation. So let me actually just share my screen. Okay. Can you see? Do you see the presentation or the?
Yes, I love the title.
Yeah. So you guys see presenters or just the full presentation?
No, we see the full presentation.
Perfect.
Only. We don't see any of your secret notes.
Yeah, there are none, but you know, all of these pictures are pictures I took on expeditions that we had. So with the exception of the ones where I'm in them. But so my background is I'm an engineer. I went to school, undergrad and grad school in engineering, got a job working on satellites. So I spent about 11 years working on satellite propulsion systems. And it was during that time that I started trying to use my engineering skills for good, and did a lot of work with Engineers Without Borders, and went back to school a couple times. And one of those times was actually at Stanford. And that's where I had the opportunity to work with the Center for Ocean Solutions. And they were looking at a lot of different big, large scale problems. And the one that I came in to kind of help them think through was the issue of illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing, IUU fishing. So for people who don't know much about what's going on out there is, you know, we set regulations around how many fish we're allowed to take out of the ocean. And those regulations are based on science and all sorts of other things, politics and stuff like that. But the idea is if we take only that amount out, then these ecosystems have enough fish in them that they can kind of rebound and provide this endless resource of food. And, you know, which comes probably not to a surprise to many of you guys there, but we don't do that now. We don't do that very well now, and that's what IUU fishing is all about. It's everybody who's not listening to those rules, and they're actually catching more than they're allowed to catch illegally, and fueling things like overfishing, which impacts environments and stuff. So it's a big global problem. There's a lot of issues around how to understand what's going on out there, and I came in to help them think about how technology had a place in that whole thing. And I did work with them for a number of years, thinking of all these different technology ideas. And then started working with National Geographic in 2012, 2011 around this sort of work. And that's actually how I know Manu is we were part of the same Emerging Explorer class with National Geographic in 2013, but a lot of the work that came subsequently down the line in terms of supporting this idea of conservation technology happened through support that that they gave me and my organization as we're kind of going through things. So what I do now is I run a nonprofit organization called Conservify that's based in downtown Los Angeles, and kind of the goal behind Conservify was, you know, can we create an independent like technology development and research lab that can work on projects related to wildlife conservation and environmental protection. So 100% of the things we do there are somehow related to those things. And the way that we work in general is that we partner with organizations that are already out there doing that work. So people who have big field programs, so these can be NGOs or universities or independent scientists that are out there doing really great conservation work, but realizing that like they don't have access to the kinds of tools they need to take that work to the next level. And that access is because, you know, tools are expensive. It's really difficult to get them to certain parts of the world. The infrastructure is not necessarily there to support them from a communications and a power and all these sorts of things. And so we try and rethink what they actually need based around the constraints of the environment that they're working through. And so you could see in the picture, this is what the lab looks like today. Well, today it's empty, but because of COVID, but this is what it looks like now. And we have a bunch of prototyping equipment like 3D printers and laser cutters. And we have pick and place machines to build electronics and all this sorts of stuff that allows us to kind of do these sorts of things. And in practice, that work usually looks like, you know, an organization comes to us and we talk about what they really need. We go through a full process around understanding what the actual needs are versus what kind of the shiny pieces of tech that they would maybe like to play with look like. And that's usually something that's very different. And then we'll go through like a design process where we create prototypes, test them in the field, figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work, and then ultimately get to something where we build and deploy hundreds of something, thousands of something, and we go out and we put them out in the world to understand what's the changes to this planet or help in better protecting the wildlife that's there. So that work has taken us all over the world. So we do a lot of work in the Amazon rainforest, in Africa, in the Congo Basin, in Southern Africa. We've worked on glaciers and in oceans and all sorts of stuff. So it's really quite an exciting job. It's my dream job, so it's pretty exciting to be able to do that. So conservation technology in general, when I say that, I mean a very specific thing. I think technology has been used in conservation for a very long time. Even if you look back to, say, Darwin, right, you know, on a ship going to these new places, the ship was the technology that was enabling that sort of science and conservation to happen in those sorts of places, right? But when we say conservation technology, we kind of mean it as technology that is used with conservation as the core user. And a lot of times that means a very specific thing. In the past, what that meant was, how do we find existing technologies that were used in the military or in industry, and how do we adapt those existing technologies to this kind of field work scenario that we're trying to work through? What conservation technology has meant in the last 10 years has been, how do we take the needs and the requirements of conservationists and we design something from the ground up with those conservationists as the core users, and how do we make sure that what we're building is something that's, you know, affordable, sustainable, it's easy to be maintained. If it fails, and it fails in a way that's graceful and doesn't, you know, damage the animal or the data or anything else that's related to that sort of thing. And so that second bit is really what I work on. I work on how do we start from a blank sheet of paper and actually build the things that people need to do the work that they're doing out there. So broadly, when you look at the kinds of applications and the work that's happening in conservation technology, they fall under some big buckets nowadays. One is wildlife crime. So it's how do we build the tools that can help stop the poaching of animals, overfishing and illegal fishing, and the tracking of those sorts of illegal activities so that we could stop it and we can try and protect these animals. Another is how do we mitigate the impacts caused by humans to help to preserve these ecosystems and preserve these animals in a state that allows them to flourish and grow and have a future. Another is how do we build better tools for field science, and so the kind of data that scientists are gathering when they're out in these ecosystems is more useful to make actionable conservation decisions as a result of it. So how do we build better tools for that sort of work? And last is how do we build better mechanisms and tools for industry that's using these ecosystems so that they can minimize their impact or understand activities behind this. There's a lot of work in this space around monitoring fisheries or understanding logging activity and how those sorts of things are impacting these places. And the last thing,
just a quick question on this, because I want to make this a little bit political, because it is political in many ways. You know, just like the WHO, and again, I think conservation has so many organizations that are behind on principle or on paper that they believe, but because global coordination is almost essential, because these parts are consumed from one place, transported to other places, who would you, in your mind, just personal opinions, is leading the charge in enabling technologies to better empower folks, but at that same time has the political capital to that once a project proves its worth on a local level, has the capacity to stamp and scale? I mean, you know, the way I think of the role of WHO, who currently is in that leadership position?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think in practice, it looks like the ones that tend to be have the most effective successes. Now, not to say that they're entirely effective, because they are not, are the large NGOs. So there's large NGOs, the ones that we've all heard of, like Conservation International or the Nature Conservancy and WWF, that actually have had successes through these sorts of things because they have a size and a level of funding that allows them to influence government decisions in a way that a lot of scientists or maybe labs within universities don't necessarily have that sort of thing. I think when it comes to conservation, you're totally right that there's a problem with what they call paper parks. So, you know, governments will establish these marine reserves or these big national parks, but then once it's kind of signed in paper, nothing happens, right? There's no actual protection of the things that are in there. It's still, everything operates the same way. There's still logging, illegal logging happening and all these sorts of things. And so there are a lot of groups within like the environmental justice world that have been doing really good about showcasing these things still happening and helping to kind of add this sort of forcing function on it. And I think the good thing about where I think conservation technology in general is, particularly around the anti-poaching stuff, is there's a lot of interest in it from funders. So, you know, people who have an idea actually have access to the sorts of funds that allows them to scale out that idea. There's still a lot to be said about what that funder landscape looks like, and how, you know, a lot of the people who are from the conservation or the environmental world do not understand tech development on a level that they need to, right, to adequately support these sorts of projects to allow them to scale. But there's a lot of really great discussions, and I see like things shifting towards that way right now.
Yeah, I think once Julie and Alice, in the very end, I want to come back to this question as well on the need of the organizational side. But yeah.
Yeah, so this slide is kind of just an extension of what I was saying before, that a lot of times when it came to the tools that are used in field science, they were created in much of the same way that I think a lot of scientific tools are, where there's a a tool that was developed in a university lab or something to answer a question. And then that just becomes the de facto tool that everybody who's looking at that stuff is going to be using, right? Which works really good to get things at a high level of like precision and accuracy and all this sort of stuff, but it doesn't really work if you want to scale into the global south, right? It creates these kinds of situations. And so a lot of the work that we do at Conservify is working with scientists from Cameroon and Botswana and Peru and places where, like, you know, they can't necessarily afford the same tools that Stanford or Yale or these sorts of scientists can afford. So how do we create those sort of mechanisms to allow them to study their backyards, these really high biodiversity places in their backyards, in a way that's more accessible? And that's kind of this more agile sort of development methodology we try and use. One of the things that we do specifically at Conservify is open source everything that we work on, and this is something that's really kind of gaining a lot of traction in the conservation technology community, is this idea of open sourcing your hardware and software to allow other people to do it. And I think that's a good movement forward. And then open data, we're working a lot to try and kind of push this idea of making sure your data is open to allow other people to kind of use it, take it and combine it to gather some interesting knowledge out of it. Some of the other areas that we've worked on that I think are really interesting within conservation technology is there's a lot of scientists like to track animals throughout their ecosystems. They do this to really answer some core scientific questions about the animals, but also help to influence, you know, where to draw the boundaries around protected areas, or where to understand where populations are healthy and unhealthy, and what's happening in those sorts of areas. These animal tags traditionally have been very expensive. So, you know, we were working with some scientists in New Zealand on a project where a single tag was $9,000. You know, we at our lab tore that tag apart and looked at the BOM costs, and, you know, it was like just under $200 in terms of parts costs that they have on this sorts of thing. So the profit margins were just unreal. But there's a lot of effort right now in terms of creating open source tags that anybody can use to produce that sort of science, and we've been involved in a number of those. One of the other projects that I found that was pretty interesting was, so we started a collaboration with this organization called Rainforest Connection. And so Topher White, who's also part of the Nat Geo community, he started this project a couple years back where they were taking old cell phones that nobody needed anymore and put them in the rainforests to listen for illegal logging activity, chainsaws, motorcycles, things like that are happening in the rainforests. It gained a lot of traction, and we worked with him a little bit on how to take that idea and bring it into marine protected areas. So if you wanted to listen for vessel traffic in places where vessel traffic wasn't supposed to be, how do you create mechanisms to do that? And so we have some buoys that are over here in the port of Los Angeles, listening around in vessel traffic, trying to characterize what those vessel signatures look like. The cool thing about it is, you know, there was research done that shows that you can just based off of the acoustic signature of the prop on the boat, you can tell what kind of fishing it's engaged in. You can tell the size of the vessel and lots of other really interesting things. So I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening in the acoustic space when it comes to conservation technology. Also an area that a lot of people do research within places like rainforests, because they'll put acoustic receivers out to try and be able to identify animal types and in some cases count the number of animals that are out there. One thing that we've been working
next week, we'll cover a couple of technologies on acoustics used in the insect world as well. So yeah, there's a lot at all length scales.
Yeah, there's two areas, both in acoustics and in camera trap technology, where there's quite a lot of work going on right now within conservation technology, specifically around how you can do some, you know, machine learning, AI on the edge sorts of things. So, and I'll tell a little story about that when I get into my next one of the projects we've been working on. So we've been trying to create low-cost tools for helping with fisheries. So in a lot of fisheries across the world, the way that they try and stop people from illegally fishing or overfishing is they, in order to get a permit to fish, you have to like put these transponders on your boat that allows people to know where you're at and what sort of activities you're doing. These things are very expensive and they use satellite communications. So for the 99% of fishers out there that are not large industrial vessels, it's prohibitive. So we've been working a lot with a bunch of partners on how to create lower cost tools to allow some of these coastal areas to monitor the activity that's happening within their waters. And I think one area where conservation technology has a huge potential to do amazing things is in citizen science. There's a huge excitement for people to be able to do something and feel active. And I know, I mean, the work that you guys do at your lab is prime example of this. But you also look at projects like iNaturalist and eBird and some of these other things that have been built to allow anybody to take a part in this sort of work. And it's a really neat thing to be able to see and partake in. I've been working with drone technology for a long time. I say long time because I've been working on it since when you had to build your own autopilots and everything. So you couldn't just buy one off of Amazon and have it show up. And that's an area where there's a lot of excitement within conservation to use that tech to kind of do monitoring from afar to make sure that you're not actually impacting what you're seeing because you're high enough that the animals can't hear the drone. When I first started working on this, actually it was the first grant I got from the National Geographic Society was some of this footage, but it was around how to build better drones for coastline monitoring. So anything along the coastlines, how can you build a drone to do that? And I spent the majority of that grant documenting the best ways to build a drone. But that technology moved so quickly over the course of that grant that by the end of it, the conclusion of my grant report was just to go out and buy something. Ignore the last 150 pages of this report and just go out and buy something because that tech has moved so quickly. So some of the stuff that we've done with that work was I was in Sri Lanka last year working with Ocean Swell to do monitoring of blue whales. So we were monitoring the health and behavior of whales out there, but most particularly their unique blue whale population that they have. The region also is a part of Sri Lanka that has become very popular from a tourist perspective, and that has brought in a lot of whale watching boats, and those whale watching boats have created a bit of a stress on the whale populations down there. So part of what we meant to do was to fly over and monitor the vessel activity that's happening in that space, because ship strike and kind of stressing of whales is a big issue in that area. And then the last thing was, we worked with Asha, who runs Ocean Swell here, and some of the volunteers that she has to build out kind of an understanding of how you can use these sorts of tools to do that sort of work. So we did this kind of knowledge sharing on what sort of things you need to pay attention to when you're flying drones, and how do you do the science around whale monitoring and stuff like that when it comes to drones. Another drone related project that we worked on was in the Republic of Congo, where we're working with the Zoological Society of London. And this was the camera trap one that I was going to talk a little bit about. So this project was, it's kind of cool. They were looking at Western lowland gorillas in this region who have picked up this very specific behavior where they go to a certain type of tree and they dig pretty deep, move a lot of dirt, and they end up getting to a part of that root of that tree, and they eat that root of the tree. And the reason why the researchers were interested in that was because that behavior is not a natural gorilla behavior. It's never been observed in other gorilla populations. It was something that one guerrilla group had learned, and they had since been tracking that knowledge as it passed through adjacent guerrilla communities moving out. And so right now, the way that camera traps work in most places, including this project, is they buy the kind of off-the-shelf camera traps that hunters and other people use. And then they put them in these places where they think like interesting stuff's going to happen, and then load them up with batteries and an SD card and leave. And this project specifically has something like 37 camera traps that are actively running at one time. So basically, by the time you put that 37th in its place and turn it on, you have to go back to the first one and change the batteries and the SD card. So it's this like constant, cycle of batteries and SD cards. And the frustrating part with that was that you can get into these situations where, your camera shuts off immediately and you don't know, or like something happens to your camera and you won't know for 2 weeks. And you could lose important data. So what we were coming to do was to do some drone-based mapping of that region for a couple things. One was we were trying to identify where all that specific type of tree are, so that they can know where to put their traps. And we also got a three-dimensional model of that area that had elevation and all sorts of other interesting information on it, so that we can actually set up a radio network throughout that region and connect these camera traps to radios so that they can get telemetry from the cameras. They can understand, like, is the camera on, how many shots is it taking, things like that, and better plan out that cycle that they have to go on constantly to deal with the camera traps.
So a quick technical question, Shao, on the drone and the noise produced. What is the actual range? I mean, I can see a noise versus footage resolution plot. And especially if you're talking about regions where stressing the animals, I know, both you and I saw that footage of a rhino being chased by a drone. And
right.
Could you say a word or two about what not to do with drones and the caution? Because frankly, they have become so accessible that there is also the danger of these technologies to be misused by primarily either tourism or just what are the cautions about conservation and drones? What is the distance limit? Has anybody laid out, if a new medical device was laid out, somebody would write, this is the IFU of it. This is what you should do and this is what you should not do. So could you say a word about that?
Yeah, totally. And there actually has been a lot of really, really good work that's happened in that space. So for much of, if you're studying bears or whales, the scientists who have been using drones over the last couple of years have started to publish standards around, like, oh, here's what the noise level, based off of what we know about the biology of the animal and the behavior of the animal. This is kind of the rough area, the rough distance you have to keep from the animal to make sure that you're not actually disturbing it. So there are guidelines, and it varies based off of environment and animal, but largely it's going to be farther away than you think it's going to be, just as a general sense. And you're right, the risk of people doing bad things when it comes to that technology is actually a really important one to monitor. That's why when we work with anybody who wants to use that technology, it goes through a very, very kind of rigorous process to make sure that drones are actually what they need to do the sort of things that they are doing. There's been, for a couple of years there, I was getting called left and right for people who wanted to use drones on projects, and we would sit down and I'd say only like 20% of them actually needed the drones, whereas the other 80% needed something else. I mean, I spent some time in Barbuda in the Caribbean, helping them figure out a plan around fisheries monitoring there, and they thought they needed a drone to monitor this marine protected area, and they took me up to the cliff and showed me the area and where the fishing was happening and what they wanted to monitor. And the conclusion was they needed to kind of pay a guy and give him a case of beer and have him sit there with a pair of binoculars, and that would have done 99% of what that drone would have gotten in that case. So that's the risk of conservation technology in general, is that tech nowadays is very cool and popular, and a lot of people want whatever's that little shiniest, newest, most cutting edge thing is, and in many cases that's definitely not what you need.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, that work was happening in Republic of Congo, and it's still going on. But a lot of the stuff I've been working on recently is like in how to bring down the cost of environmental monitoring. And this is this field kit project. It's what you see behind me. I'll talk a little bit more about that. There was I think a huge potential in this space to do this right in a way that makes sense from a science standpoint. And I'll talk about some of the projects we were working on there.
And so you should think about maybe 10, 12 minutes more.
Okay,
yeah.
That's fine. Yeah. So we worked on a project with Parks Canada in Banff National Park. So this is Banff National Park pictured here, around monitoring of this glacier, the Bow Glacier that you see there. The Bow Glacier was melting fast. They really wanted to kind of understand how it was melting in three-dimensional space. So they brought us in to kind of instrument that glacier in a way that was non-invasive and actually gave them that sort of data. So we came in and we prototyped kind of low-cost sensors to be able to do that sort of application, and traveled up there and deployed it and created this kind of real-time glacial monitoring observatory is what we call it. The interesting thing about this project is that a lot of the parts that we used, we really tried to use things that were accessible to anyone, since the whole thing was open source. So there's things like Raspberry Pis in this thing that are running a lot of the systems that we're working on. And we actually brought the data back. We wanted to have live real-time data, but we didn't want to have to like rely on big expensive satellites. So we actually beamed the data back to this tourist lodge, and the tourist lodge just uploads the data over their internet connection. The interesting thing around funding when it came to this project is a lot of times funding with these sorts of projects might be kind of hard to find. If you're not getting government funding or foundation funding or academic funding or something like that, like it could be pretty difficult. And the partners we had with this project actually were working with the city of Calgary. And the city of Calgary was looking at increasing scientific communication efforts that are happening there. And they had some money within their arts program to do that. And so when we pitched this idea to them, they're really excited because the Bow Glacier you see here flows through to the Bow River, and that river makes its way all the way down through downtown Calgary. It's a big reason why Calgary was founded where it was. And so they actually funded this project, and all the data that's collected here is played live in this big public park in the middle of downtown Calgary. So they actually built this park that looks like the glacier, and the seismic activity is translated into lights and sounds in that park. It's kind of a cool project, and it had a little bit of a different angle to it, even though, you know, the data is also being used by glaciologists in Canada, but at the same time, it has this kind of public art bend to it. So the work that we're doing around that sensors, kind of a lot of it started in stuff that I was doing in Botswana and in the Okavango Delta years back, since 2014. So we were working on trying to protect this place called the Okavango Delta, which is this really amazing habitat. And we wanted to collect data about it and make that data live so anyone could see. So we built this website that unfortunately is not online anymore, but it was called Into the Okavango, where like all the data that we were collecting on during our expeditions was streamed live to this website for anyone to kind of follow along while we were doing that. And we were really looking at kind of lower cost sensors. So the idea was, you know, this DIY approach we're using with Okavango, we spent a lot of time, we learned all the technology we needed to, and that allowed us to kind of build the hardware and the software needed to do that sort of thing. Now, there's another way to do it that a lot of people have done in the past, which is kind of the buy it yourself approach, you know, where you spend a lot of money, you don't have to spend a lot of time or know a lot about the technology, but you can get the same sort of science done. What we were trying to do with this project was, how do we create something that anybody can replicate what we did in the Okavango and kind of do it in other places? And that's really where we came up with this idea of field kit. So you know, something that has low barriers to entry and at the same time allows you to kind of do solid field science. So FieldKit itself is, it's a couple things. It's the sensor hardware that we've built. So I'll hold one up right here, but it's a bunch of different sensor types. It's an app that allows you to kind of communicate with the hardware and also deploy it in a way that collects the right sort of metadata, that if other people see that sensor data, they can say, I trust that sensor data because they have all this right sort of scientific metadata behind it. And then the last bit is a data visualization website. So, you know, one of the other people who was involved in FieldKit was this individual named Jer Thorpe, who is this big data visualization guru, and Jer is kind of in charge of like figuring out what's the best way to understand that environmental data. So as I said, you know, like the spectrum of environmental sensors when it comes to field science is quite long. On one end, you have this home built, like open source sort of projects. On the other end, you have this custom built one-off scientific equipment. And there's a big middle part that can kind of leverage a lot of the consumer IoT home built stuff and at the same time reach for this sort of science that's possible through the really expensive stuff. And that's sort of what we're aiming to do. And working not only with field scientists, but also citizen scientists, educators, and others. So we've been deploying that with the Wildlife Conservation Society across the entire Amazon basin, and it's something that we're continuing to do. This project is really interested in understanding the waters through the Amazon, and like seeing, you know, monitoring conservation as a byproduct of understanding what the fish are doing in the region and the water quality is doing in the region and all that sort of stuff. So we've been deploying, you know, FieldKit sensors that we built earlier, prototypes with
and then
indigenous.
Can you just list the list of sensors that are in the current FieldKit?
Yeah, I was going to get to that a little bit.
What's the cost trade-off look like?
I was going to get to that a little bit later.
Okay, no worries then. Yeah,
just in a minute or so.
Yeah.
So we've been working with indigenous groups to kind of deploy that throughout that area. We also work with the Smithsonian at the American Prairie Reserve, and we've been deploying FieldKit sensors and a LoRa network in that area. And then we've been doing stuff with UCLA and NSF around work that they're doing in the Jaw Reserve, which is a forest reserve in southern Cameroon, where we've deployed FieldKit and a radio network out there as well. So to get to what you're saying, Manu, like the hardware that we build is open source. The brains of the hardware, so like the microcontroller and that whole thing, it's like around $100 for everything, including GPS and all that sort of stuff. And then we've built it in a way. The interesting thing we've done with FieldKit that other people haven't done in this space is we've built it to be like supremely modular. So you can like plug and play and change things however you want. So here's just kind of an idea. So you could plug in water quality and weather and all these sorts of things. So right now we have a bunch of water quality parameters like pH and dissolved oxygen and conductivity and temperature. We have water level. We've built a weather station. There's a number of air quality parameters that we're working on right now with particulate matter and ozone and CO2 and all this other stuff. So basically we're building internally, Conservify, we're building all these different sensor modules, but since the whole thing's open source, we're also working with outside people to build their own sensor modules and make use of this kind of like data backend and pipeline that we've sort of written as well. And so, and in terms of costs, yeah, I mean, costs vary, the costs vary depending on the sensors mostly. So like some, you know, dissolved oxygen sensors are much more expensive than water temperature sensors, you know, but the little modules themselves, it's like $10 to make those things. So they're, you know, they're fairly cheap. So you can have something up and running for like $120 or something like that, depending on what you want to do. Or since the designs are open, you can build them all yourself. I mean, we're a nonprofit and we're foundation funded. So, you know, we're not taking a normal profit margin that people would take on building these sorts of things. You know, if you buy electronics off Amazon or whatever, like those usually have built in a massive profit margin, and we're, you know, not even relatively close to that. But we also created an enclosure for it that we think works better than what's out there. And then, as I said, with the app, you know, it guides people through the deployment, allows them to like look at the visualizations. And then the website also does the same sort of thing in terms of allows people to kind of share and comment and open up their data to anybody who wants to see and look at maps and charts and things like that. But one of the cool things that we're doing as a result of it is we're building this thing called Open Sensor Library. So everything we learn about building different sensor types and like what is currently out there and kind of the code, the designs, the calibration methodologies, all that stuff, we're putting that all onto like an open wiki for anybody to really take and do whatever they want with. So it's kind of our kind of the way we capture knowledge as we're building these things. We're putting it out there for anybody to do. And you know, we're really into kind of things being open and accessible and reliable. So we've built in a bunch of functionality around that to allow you to do that. And you know, we have a bunch of field kit projects that are coming up in the next couple of years. We were originally going to make this available for people to buy from us if they wanted to on Earth Day, and then COVID hit, and that kind of changed everything and really affected supply chains. So we were dealing with trying to get parts all the way up until just 2 weeks ago. So this stuff's going to come out later on this year, but we did do a giveaway of 50 of them to projects and across 27 countries. So as soon as all the parts are in, we're going to mail those out to water quality and weather stations, depending on whatever people needed. And there's some really amazing projects of people working on that. So yeah, I mean, the last three charts are just charts I wanted to say. I know a lot of people here are trying to look through how they could build these ideas around using frugal science and creating these better tools. And there's three things that I can say in terms of giving some advice. One is like, find something that you're passionate about. I was very passionate about conservation, and I didn't think I could do that as an engineer, but found this space to be able to do that. And that really allowed me to kind of push forward and take it in ways that I wouldn't have been able to do if I was trying to work on something that I wasn't super passionate about. So think about that as you're thinking through these sorts of projects. And then, you know, the skills, like I focused a lot on how to better understand what we were trying to build when we were trying to build it. A lot of people might come into a problem and think they understand it 100%, and I think in most cases that just means you haven't really listened enough, and that you need to listen to the people who really know what they're doing and grow your own specific skills and how your own specific skills can help to solve those sorts of problems. I think that's an important thing to think, is that you know, there's a lot of people out there that have been fighting against these problems for a very long time, and these subject matter experts are absolutely critical to being able to build something that is scalable and will actually work in the world and not just become another tool or idea that people forgot about. Yeah, and the last bit is I just think that everybody here should kind of keep on exploring. If you find something and it doesn't work, just keep on trying to find something new, because there's a lot of problems to be solved out there. So that's it.
Okay. On that note, I think I want to make sure I cover all the content for today's. So why don't we do this, is that we'll kind of take questions and threads in the very end. Let's jump with that same theme now to get to more molecular side of the story. So maybe Julie and Allison, which way would you want to start? Would you want to start first, Julie, setting the context of the problems, and then pass to Allison?
We're going to
have basically another 30-35 minutes.
Okay, great. So we thought we would kind of tag team,
Perfect.
And I'll let Allison start us off.
I was just going to say that, first of all, that presentation was amazing. It's such a cool array of projects. So a tough act to follow. We're going to talk basically off the cuff about what we do in the lab and what we do individually. And Julie is going to start by talking, I think, about the IUCN and some of her work there, and then shift into talking about the Hadley Lab and some of our projects. I can give detail on that, and then I can talk a little bit about databases. But the big thing is, please break in with questions or thoughts as we go, because as I said, we're working a little off the cuff here.
Yeah, I mean, this is completely informal, and this is exactly what we want it to be, is to feel a conversation. But at that same time, I think it's very valuable to cover the breadth, all the way from the sets of technologies that are available versus the sets of technologies that still need to be built, because the problem space is very, very large. So back to you, Julie. If you want to share your screen or anything, just go ahead and do that.
Yeah, well, thanks. And yeah, Shah, that was such a cool presentation. So like Allison said, so as it's informal, I think it's best to just be completely, just sort of tell a story that kind of illustrates maybe some other perspectives that add to this class.
Yes.
So I worked at IUCN. For those of you who don't know, that's the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And it also produces the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. And I worked on the Red List. And that was a while ago, but I probably spent 10 years there. And when you work on the Red List, people say, oh, so how many species are going extinct and how's the world doing? And which one will go extinct next? And the reality, if I can like lift up and show you the behind the scenes, is that we would go to assessment workshops with people on the ground, and they'd be people who work on the ground. We bring them around the table to apply the quantitative criteria that allow us to then categorize species into one of the categories of risk, which goes from least concerned to critically endangered. And people would say, well, we just don't have enough data. And you think, well, you're the foremost expert on this species. We invited you to this workshop. You're at an expert workshop around the table. We have 1 week. We've got to get all your data, just like download it to us. And you're typing away like crazy trying to pull this species assessment together. And they're saying, I don't have enough data. I'm not confident. I can't assess the species. I won't put it on the red list. And so it just shows that there are such big data gaps. The red list has assessed about 10% of described species, but there are about 1.7 to 2 million described species. And if you saw in the news last year when IPBES published that about 1 million species are at risk of extinction, you might think, well, how can 1 million? Well, so they extrapolated based on which species groups are comprehensively assessed on the IUCN Red List. They then said, what's the kind of average portion that are extinct, threatened with extinction? What's a concern that based on 1 million? And that means that there's a lot of places where we don't specifically know what is the range of that species. We don't specifically know size.
So Julie, your audio is cutting in and out a little bit.
We need those eyes on the ground. And then in the Hadley lab.
So Julie, if you turn your video off, I wonder if the audio quality will improve.
Yeah, all right. So I'm really sorry about that.
No worries.
I'll just
now
continue.
It's back again. Yes.
If there, okay. So not knowing exactly where it cut out too much.
You were saying something about the, I think you cut off when you used the word in the Hadley lab.
Okay, good. Okay, thanks. So, I end up in the Hadley lab as a project manager trying to help Liz, who's one of the mentors for this class, to design a class that will take students out into the field to have this really transformative conservation experience. And along the way, I get to see the specific questions that they're trying to answer. And as Liz would put it, it's not just that we need more eyes on the ground to figure out what is happening with each individual species so that we know how to stop them from sliding towards extinction. We need all of our senses. So what we're kind of looking for is a better way to monitor diversity, to be able to monitor it visually with camera traps, with acoustic things. So before I get into that, and maybe Allison, feel free to jump in here, but as Allison was kind of introducing about the lab, we're looking at and genetic level is falling, but how can we do that if we're having trouble just capturing all these species on a camera trap? So an example there is camera traps are picking up large animals that move slowly enough where the infrared detects them and has time to get a photo. But what about the small ones that run fast too quickly? Liz has also mentioned that, what about chemical signals? Something that could be used like a portable nose that could tell you that it has detected pheromones from a carnivore that's passed through that environment recently. So we kind of imagine like a portable
Julie,
backpack.
just a clarification on this currently. Can you say a word about, if I was to plot the species on the red list as a function of their size? I mean, just intuitively, as animals that are large, we are biased towards large things. I'm just curious, how does that distribution look like?
Well, that's a great question. I wish I had an off the top of my head. I wish I had the top, some of the
assignment for this week. What we'll end up doing is anybody who wants to take that challenge, because I think it'd be very valuable to see what we are really missing.
Yeah, the groups, I mean, the groups of species that are comprehensively assessed, where they feel that they have either assessed literally every species from that group, which would be birds, to the ones where they say it's comprehensive because they've done a big enough sample of what they could do, like the reef-forming corals. We've got the birds, the mammals, amphibians, reef-forming corals, and cycads, which are an ancient group of plants. So that's very few groups, and that leaves a lot that's not fully been assessed more than allowed to draw a trend. Is that for many groups we don't have a trend line. So yes, just highlighting what's unknown. There have been a lot of studies on using the red list data, like to look at, well, how are the pollinator species faring? But yeah, and perhaps there is one that answers that question, Manu, about size of the animal versus where it falls on the red list.
Yeah, this would be fun actually, just for everybody, at least in the class, who's interested in conservation efforts, to learn how to download red list data, how to use it, how to plot it. It's a great way to begin to look at it in a much more granular but computational ways.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to talk to me separately about that, I'd be happy to look through it with you. I can pull up the Red List website on my screen if you want me to.
No, I think let's continue. We'll kind of take that offline on Discord, basically.
Yeah, sure. So
maybe,
you know, in
Julie,
terms of
one thing that you, for people might not know the class that Liz and I and many others have been talking about, which was going to happen, but got moved to next year because of COVID. Could you just introduce that class as well? Just a few more words about it, the premise of that class broadly, where it was supposed to happen and other factors.
Yeah, I would love to. It is an exciting class. So the idea is to develop a new class for Stanford undergrads that creates an immersive field experience focused on biodiversity and how to learn some of the real technical skills, such as sequencing in the field for measuring biodiversity. And there were a couple of really unusual and special elements of it. One was that we were going to go to a field site and co-learn with students in Rwanda who might have, those quote unquote students might have been, you know, the park managers from that park in Rwanda. Another was that we're going to take this approach of kind of a rapid assessment in the field of what are the challenges they're facing and what are some of the essentially quick solutions and frugal solutions that we could bring to them. Another is that we were specifically targeting underrepresented minorities in STEM subjects. And as an aside, also at Stanford, that many Stanford students don't study abroad or don't go to remote places where they understand what are the true constraints that you have when you are far from a cell phone signal or an internet signal. How do you, for example, keep those camera traps powered? How do you get that data reliably? And so that's the kind of thing, is like, could we develop, expose students to this way of thinking and at the same time build these true partnerships. So it's kind of a new model for learning, and it was going to be a short course, 3-week course. And so we're just seeing if we'll be able to do it next year based on COVID and travel, or if we're going to do some adapted version. And yeah, Liz and Manu and a few others are co-teaching that. So, that reminds me that Liz was really excited to hear, and sorry that she missed the lectures about paper, because using paper to be able to, especially to pick up and detect diversity that you detect either in water or in animal scats or in soils or in tissues, so that then you can stabilize, collect and stabilize DNA. Maybe you need to do some processing in the field. Maybe you need to send it home for more analysis, but paper could be an excellent tool for that. And she's really excited to see and explore with all of you where we could go with that.
Maybe for context, Julie or Allison, could you just describe Liz's work in tiger conservation and kind of the genomic work that has happened in the past as well? Because that colors the background, so it would actually be valuable for people to know. I don't know if Allison, Julie, who wants to take that? Just a little bit of a historic perspective of the lab as it moved from more traditional conservation and arrived at technology as an important cause. But, you all came to this problem as biologists, which is unique and different from any students here that might be coming. Some of them are coming as technologists, some of them are coming as biologists. And this is why I tag team this to make sure that, the biology is represented.
So I may have to punt this back to Julie. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Because I kind of missed her tiger phase.
Yeah, I know.
Do you know the history of that, Julie?
Actually, sadly, I don't know the details of Liz's genomic work in the tigers, but I think it's interesting that, Manu, you put that in the context of how Liz's lab has evolved over time, because she started her work in Yellowstone and looking at the very distant past, and that's kind of what Allison does. So maybe, Allison, you could just give a bit of an overview. I think Liz also talked about it recently in one of our lab meetings of how the lab has, her work, the sort of scale and time horizons she's looked at has changed over the last 20, 25 years.
Yeah, so Liz and I both, under her guidance, started out kind of in the paleo realm, wanting to put today's ecosystems in the context of a much longer time frame. So Liz started out working in Yellowstone. I think she was actually the park paleontologist for Yellowstone when she decided to go on and get her master's degree. And she was looking at small mammal communities in Yellowstone using pack rat middens, which are they're fossil accumulations where pack rats drag bones into caves and they accumulate over time and so on. And these nests are full of little tiny bones. You can identify them visually. You can also use ancient DNA techniques on them. So she started out with this paleo perspective, but then got into the ancient DNA. And from ancient DNA and DNA more generally, you can do a lot more about population dynamics and tracing endangered species like tigers and even the wildlife trade and things like that. So I actually worked with Liz back in 2009, and at that point the lab was really more paleontology focused. Came back in 2019 as a postdoc, and I think we only have 2 people in the lab working on fossils now. Everyone else is really looking at genetic signatures of human impacts, whether it's wildlife, lion populations, tigers, or disease. I don't know if that gives a good trajectory, but.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's all. I just kind of wanted to mention that. And I think many of you already know that, Uma and Liz have also worked together on the tiger genomics side of the story. Yeah. And one of the aspects which is represented on campus is, I think 2 years ago, we started a Center for Conservation Genomics at Stanford, which is really about using genomic technologies because field genomics is now becoming fairly widely acceptable, but apply them to very specific problems. And I think some of the relationships with what Julie mentioned, I just want to link all the things that we talked about. Diagnostics are actually, and molecular diagnostics are directly applicable here, because we can do, just like identify a disease, you can also do both DNA, RNA extraction in the field and identify using the same sets of molecular technologies, species-specific signatures. And so one of the things that I'm excited about for certain sets of projects and is to converge what is used. How can we bring tools that have been built for human health to both animal health and to identify animals out there? Because I think in some sense, there are no hospitals for wild animals in general. But on the other hand, the same sets of tools and technologies are very directly applicable. So there's a beautiful intersection space. What can we borrow and learn from how we have made healthcare accessible to people and apply them to the field? And, you know, many of the LAMP, PCR, nanopore technologies are very accessible. So Allison, we have maybe 15 minutes. I want you to kind of dive into the soil paleontology as well, because it's a very unique space, and looking at deep time, and the world is our fossil, and especially on the microscopic scale. So because next lecture, I'll talk a lot about soil. So if you want to take the next 10 minutes or so, describe your own work, that would be fun.
Yeah, so we've been talking, I think, primarily about monitoring and sensing what's on the planet today. But what I think about is basically, how do you do that back in time? And I've got one slide here to share. Let's see, where did it go? Here we go. Can you guys see that slide?
Perfect.
Okay.
That is exactly the picture I was hoping you would show. We are seeing your presenter mode. So you have to kind of...
I didn't even know there were notes on this. So
it doesn't matter.
It's irrelevant. If you can see that, that's all you need to see. So I study, at this point in my career, I study sediment cores collected from lakes. And this is a picture of us coring Searsville Reservoir at Jasper Ridge. There are hundreds and hundreds of sites like this across the planet where we've gone out and collected a sediment core from a lake, and you can pull microfossils out of these cores. So I've shown a few examples on the side here. This is a phytolith. It comes from grasses. I actually don't know what these are. This is pollen. I think there's some diatoms here. There are so many different kinds of microfossil and you know, remains of the past that we can use to reconstruct what happened. We use pollen to reconstruct how vegetation changed. Charcoal actually is a really important one that we think about in the fossil record. We use charcoal to trace how fire frequencies change through time when forest fires occurred. That's actually has some really direct links to wildfire planning today. I'm just gonna, let's see, how do I'm gonna stop sharing this, and I'm gonna share another page here.
And then there were a few sets of clarification questions on that picture itself. I don't know whether to
share it. Go ahead and ask them now.
Share that picture one more time. Sure. Just when people look at that picture, as the length, I see the x-axis is the depth you have covered. Could you say a word or two about the time? How much, how back in time have you gone? Say a word or two about the technology that is used to core.
Okay.
What does it take to make a core? How do you, can you make a core anywhere? And then also, I think what I'm interested in, and especially the discussions we have had, is to apply some of our high throughput optics tools to identifying and sampling, because it's a massive sample. Could you describe the labor of love that is needed currently to do this? And I want to transition that in the next lecture. We will talk a lot about Frugal optics to apply those tools to this. So yeah, just a few.
Okay. So I'll start by talking about how, sorry, go ahead.
Just describe the process of how you do this. You arrive in a boat, and what next?
So you arrive in a boat. This boat actually is built to be taken apart into pieces so that it can be carried through the woods, over hill and dale, and put together at the shore of a lake that's not accessible by truck. So that alone is actually a huge piece of important equipment for us. So you arrive with your boat, you set up a platform, and then you have a coring device of some kind. In this case, it's a vibracore. You can see, can you guys see my arrow? Okay. Yeah. You can see this is the aluminum pipe that we use to core, it's actually exactly what they use on big farms for irrigation. It's just a aluminum pipe you buy at an agricultural supply store. And it's connected to a coupling that is itself connected to something that's called a vibrator head, which is what contractors use to shake the bubbles out of cement. So ordinarily you'd throw it into cement and it would vibrate at high frequency to shake those bubbles out. We attach it to the coring pipe because, as you can imagine, it's really hard to drive through these old sediments, and it just shakes it down into the bottom of the lake using power from this generator here. So you asked a little bit about the depth. So this is an example of a core. This is a core from Searsville. So I'll just mention that Searsville, the sediments in the Searsville Reservoir are 11 meters deep, which is incredibly deep. That's a ton of sediment to get through. It was actually the longest core that the USGS here, this team here, had collected using their rig. So that's a itself just a physically major enterprise to collect this. This is an example of a little section of core. These numbers on the side are the depths in centimeters. And of course, what we want to know is what is the age of any particular layer, so we can relate, you know, the pollen record from this core to what vegetation looked like at a certain point in time. So there are a lot of different ways that we date a core. One of the major ones is radiocarbon. It doesn't actually work for younger sites. So Searsville Reservoir is only about 125 years old. That's too young for radiocarbon. You can use other radionuclides like, not radionuclides, radioactive elements like lead. Lead-210 dating is another method that we use. We also use just chemical signatures. So in Searsville, we have a big peak in copper that we know from X-ray fluorescence detecting. And that copper actually comes from algicide treatments. So they were trying to get rid of algae when the site was used for as a swimming hole for the kids of Stanford. And they used, I think, copper sulfide. So we have this huge layer of copper. We know when they added that to the lake, so we can relate that depth to the time. And then we make a model that we use to estimate the time. So you were asking about high throughput imaging and things like that. And I'll just talk a little bit about what we've done with this core. So the first thing you do when you've collected a core is you split it in half. You take a high resolution photo. That's what this is actually. You use a kind of camera, and I couldn't tell you about the technology really. It's very complicated to set up, but it basically, it takes an RGB reading rather than an image, and then it puts it together as a scan. We also do XRF scanning, X-ray fluorescence, to sense what elements are in the core. That has been a huge advent in paleoecology. In my opinion, it could be a lot faster and a lot better. Could sense a lot more elements. It would save us a lot of time running things through a mass spec. We also CT scan the cores, so that's basically exactly the same as if you went to the hospital and had a CT scan of yourself. It creates an image of the density of the sediments, and we can use that to relate you know, processes like erosion or deposition of organics through time and so on. In terms of the microfossils, one thing, you know, I haven't been attending this class, but I was thinking about it in the context of frugal science. So to extract pollen, these are pollen grains here, it's like $280 per sample, and it's days of labor just to get the pollen out of the sediment. And then it's many more days to identify them visually and count them. So that, I mean, that alone, people have looked a little bit into AI, computer, like machine learning techniques for IDing pollen. It really hasn't gone anywhere. Another one was, so I was talking about charcoal. Understanding the fossil record of fire is really, really important for conservation and management. But to identify and count charcoal, you have to take a huge sample of mud, sieve it through multiple layers of sieve, count the pieces of charcoal that are a certain size, and repeat hundreds of times through your core. So, I mean, there's another place where maybe that process isn't that expensive, but the time input is massive. So there are lots of ways we could improve.
Yeah. The reason I wanted you to mention this is because in the next lecture, probably Tuesday is going to be team announcements, but in the next lecture, we will cover soil ecosystems, and I'll talk a little bit about technologies that are there and what could be developed, because it's a perfect match with the sets of technologies that need to also be developed for soil transmitted helminths. You need to identify eggs. There's a lot of space for AI, and I think some of the work that's happening in the microplastic world also allows for density segregation. So there are certain sets of tools that we've been building to do density segregation.
So plastics
are very relevant here. And
plastics are hugely interesting from the perspective of paleo, and we could even track different plastics through time, which would be fascinating. We wanted to do plastics on this core, but the cost is astronomical. It's not possible really to do it, and the contamination is really bad if you haven't started from the beginning with no tools that have plastic, no clothing that has plastic. So that, I agree, is another area where there could be a lot of great improvement.
Yeah, no, I think this is a perfect kind of a context because of the historical value of this record. So you were going to share another image.
Oh yeah, I was just going to show you one thing. It's not, we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. I gotta figure out where I put it. Okay. Hang on just a second. I thought I had it up, but. Okay. Okay, do you guys see that map?
Yes.
So I have spent a lot of time working with this database called Neotoma, which is kind of a paleoecology warehouse. I'll just show you so you have a perspective. These are all of the pollen records that are in Neotoma now. There are thousands of them across the globe. And we could talk about lots of interesting details about this map. For example, wouldn't it be fantastic to have many more records from Africa or from Australia?
Or India for that matter.
Or India, yeah. I mean, we're approaching this point where we can think about the global history, networks of paleoecological sites, but we have these huge data gaps where, you know, to process a single core, I mean, most people work on one site for their dissertation, for example. It's a ton of work. This is just pollen. You can see here all the different kinds of data that we commonly pull out of a sediment core, charcoal, ostracods, and so on.
As a test case to this, I think I'm thinking, since we are all distributed, this is the virtue of this class. The other aspect of the assignment, for this week, I'm thinking, let's divide the assignment into two. The data nerds can actually play with the red list data and plot it in a unique way. But the mud nerds, all of us try making a tiny core, like just go in your backyard and even pull out 10 centimeters of a soil core. And then if some of you have microscopes or other things, or just observe or take pictures, just to start getting a sense for both how difficult and the types of tools that are needed, would actually be a really valuable exercise, because it will get an intuition for what does it mean to make a core, even if it's 10 centimeters. And I think, you know, from a perspective of this, since the tools and technologies that you described around coring, Allison, seem to be fairly, you know, stuff that people can put together in a regular machine.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
Just a mallet, aluminum coil, aluminum pipe, you drill it to a certain extent, and then just people spend time taking pictures. And if some of you have it'll actually be a really fun exercise. I'll write that as an assignment. I mean, literally, it will teach us why this is hard and what is needed. So it's 1:50. I want to be aware of the time. So this is sort of, so first of all, thank you to all the speakers. This was just absolutely enlightening and just so joyful in so many ways, and highlights how much needs to be done. I mean, we have 110 people that are on the edge of their seats, even in these informal conversations. So this is just fantastic. We will open up for questions. So you can type questions in the chat. And then if Julie, Allison, and Shah can stay for 10 more minutes, we will take questions. And then Tyler, based on questions, you can unmute folks. But this is the end of the official portion of the class. But if any of you have questions or want to hear answers, maybe I'll take the first one, because there were a couple of questions, Shah, on the people getting access to the open source files. So is there a GitHub already or a repository online somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, if you go to fieldkit.org, but we have a fieldkit GitHub repository.
I see. So is that where they should kind of download and play with the files?
Yeah,
the website itself. Got it. Yeah.
The website itself. We also have an app in the App Store, but you need the hardware to play with the app, so it doesn't really do anything. And then the last bit was I talked about the open sensor library. So we're writing that right now. We have a couple of people who are working on it, but it's not published live. But that's going to be on fieldkit.org as well. So
yeah, I think, because there are many technical people in this class, one thread that I can immediately see is for people to really see and walk through those libraries. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions for Julie, Allison, and Shah?
And one quick logistical thing, I'm going to be creating a Google form for each of the teams to submit their presentations and list of team members to. So keep an eye out for that as you're preparing for Tuesday's just three slide presentation.
But you have to make the 3 slides impactful. Questions? Oh, Raghav has a question. Maybe I'll just read it for logistics. Raghav asks, could you elaborate on how you determine the date of a sediments of the cores? Maybe especially for cores that go further deeper in time, say beyond 100 years.
Yeah, so for a typical core, sediment cores usually they can go back as much as 30,000 years or more. Often we're just looking at the Holocene, so 10,000 years. For cores that old, the standard way of dating them is radiocarbon. So you would take a sample from your sediments. These days, the best standard is to dig through those sediments and find actual plant fossils that you can feel more reliable about. You would radiocarbon date those at different depths through the core, and then you create a model. And there's some sophisticated statistics now called Bayesian age modeling, where you basically draw linear connections between depth and time using those dates that you've got from radiocarbon to estimate the dates at depths where you didn't actually take a sample. So radiocarbon is a big one. Another one that people use pretty often actually is invasive pollen. So in North America, we know exactly within 10 years when eucalyptus came to California, for example. So when you see eucalyptus in your core, you can date that as, I think it's like 1743 or something like that. And then, as I mentioned, there's lead-210. It's basically the same as radiocarbon. I'm trying to think if there are others. Yeah, and just inference based on what you know happened in the past. You can use that correlation to other cores. Another kind of cool one is volcanic eruptions. So volcanic layers, if we know which volcano has the same chemical signature, you can relate that to the depth in the core too.
Yeah, actually, I mean, this reminds me of something that's very interesting, that as if the technology to drilling the cores could just be very widely and easily available. But if you don't have the historic records to correlate, it really is how much to read into it seems like is the harder part of the challenge. And how do you relate that to historic records? And again, anthropologist, I'm always referring to the one card-carrying anthropologist in our class. Suddenly they can say, oh, yes, I know this historic event that could have left a signature, and you could correlate that back. And then maybe on the, I guess you also pointed out that pollen becomes very important from that perspective as well.
It does. It can also get very circular. So we try to have some independent pieces of information that kind of constrain the dates before we start relying too much on the pollen. But yeah, I mean, those human signatures are really important. Even something like lead pollution. So we know that leaded gas was banned in 1970. You can trace lead drop off in a core and relate it to that too.
Yeah. So Fur, you have another anthropological anecdote. Could you just explain that? Tyler, could you unmute Fur?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was doing like field research on this community here in Mexico, and this relatively old lady told us we were making a register about heritage, but it was a special project where people could say what was its heritage instead of the authorities saying what was the heritage. So the authorities didn't mention anything about the confoterio, which is like this mammoth. I'm not sure if that's the word in English, but it's this very, 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 very old mammal, like the big elephant. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the older folks of the community told us that there was an elephant buried on the street. And we were like, what? And they said, yeah, well, they discovered it because they were making their own streets. So they called the authorities, and they didn't have the equipment to make the analysis or take it out, or because it's a very, it's a community located very, very far away from the paleontological centers, which is only one, and it's only in Mexico City. And so they decided to bury the elephant, and they constructed like the street on the top. But the cities, well, it's not actually a city, but the old folks made this community museum where they draw what they saw. So the story about the elephant lives like from the grandparents to the childs, saying that that was a land where mammoths went by, and they do not have the specific details of the animal, but they do know the fact that that part of the region was many, many, many years ago habitated by mammoths. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a beautiful example of anecdotal stories then turning out to amazing biological discoveries. Okay, any other last questions? Yeah, go ahead, Harshit.
So good morning from India. First of all, thanks for the course. It means a lot. Didn't expect I will get selected. So I have 5 questions. So the first question is for all the 3 speakers. So can we have a Teach Me Anything session on frugal ecology? Like Shah sir said about technologies for wildlife conservation. And just now, Alison ma'am showed the map in which she had someone through citizen science or crowdsourcing had mapped various sites. So can there be a Teach Me Anything session by one of the mentors to
just on
share the ideas?
The way I would structure would be let's do a Teach Me Anything session on just frugal electronics and just how to use consumer electronics for people's projects. And there are lots of people, and I think the Teach Me Anything sessions are driven by people who want to, and there is lots of people in this community. And of course, Shah, if you have like half an hour or so, you can join in and say, here are the sets of resources for you to get started on your electronics journey, because it's phenomenal what you can do with modular components that are available. And then similarly, Alison, if you have kind of a half an hour session, because we record all of these Teach Me Anything sessions, they become essentially a resource repository. And I think I'm quite excited about connecting the challenge on the course, and I've spoken to Liz a little bit about this, to connecting it to high throughput microscopy. So we could use that Teach Me Anything session as a design session for seeing what sets of technologies that are already present could be applied to this core challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Teach Me Anything are all completely volunteer basis. So I don't want to, I wrangle the mentors to give talks and share their work. But the Teach Me Anything is completely open. Anybody can teach anything. And especially if some of you who do a lot of electronics, please feel free to run miniature sessions. I know there was a soldering session that happened previously as well.
Yeah, so
And Sean,
just to
Allison,
add
feel free
up
to
on the
shoot me an
micro,
email if you want to do that.
Yeah.
just to add up on the microscopy part, Alison ma'am just showed one picture in which she had the pollen, the diatoms in the picture. So can we get those quality pictures through a fold scope? Because if that can be done, we can have a citizen science initiative maybe.
That's the whole point of for everybody to drill their course for this week, is that if all of you have full scopes,
I don't have.
drill a core for 10 centimeters and just map one object every centimeters, so 10 images. And I also just requested for some funds. One of the things that I'm trying to do is ship some full scopes out to everybody in the course. I'll follow up on that side. If some of you don't have that, this is one technology that we can immediately ship out. We're going to follow up on this side. But I think it would be fantastic to actually do that as an exercise.
And yeah, just the ending one. The idea which I put in the chat was using an app to identify fossils by the citizen scientists, because in my country, India, we have a very good fossil reserve, but unexplored, and it's been destroyed continuously. It's a dying science here. So can we have an app to at least identify the difference between rocks and fossils by citizen scientists?
Yeah.
So no picking out the fossils because they can get damaged, but only just identifying, okay, this is a fossil and this is a rock.
Harshit, you should write that in the idea board. That is a fabulous, fabulous idea. And I think especially in India, there is a lot that has been written about builders coming and destroying sites.
Yeah.
And many times these things are discovered accidentally during development. And then if there is a common community that can rapidly, imagine you are a construction worker digging and you find something. How does it rapidly go to the chain of command for people who are responsible for these things to be notified to say, okay, this is one that's relevant while this is not so relevant? It would be a fantastic thread to follow up. So write an idea board. You might have to jump teams then.
Yeah, I have to do a lot of literature survey now again.
Okay, so it's 2:02. So I want to make sure that we kind of keep this just because it's commitment on people's time. Thank you so much again for connecting. Next Tuesday is going to be a presentation session. I will write to all the mentors to connect. We will figure out the logistics. But Tyler, the idea would be is to make sure that we have slide decks from teams beforehand so that we're not switching, because otherwise it will not work out. I mean, we have regularly 100, 115, 120 people connecting. So my intuition is we might at least have 30 or 40 teams. So we'll have to figure out the logistics of this.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, everyone keep an eye out on the announcements channel. And I'll create a form for you guys to submit that. And then we'll basically, just in order of who submits the form, we're going to label those teams as like 1 through whatever. And then we'll go in that order for presenting.
Okay. All right. Bye, everybody. Get some sleep.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for connecting. Bye-bye.